So it's kind of common knowledge at this point that young H.P. Lovecraft exhibited some pretty racist views. He and a lot of those racist views very evidently spilled over into and directly influenced a lot of elements in his storytelling. Particularly, it's obvious in stuff like the Horror Red Hook or Call of Cthulhu. Whenever he talks about like the nautical-looking Negroes that were responsible for the death of his uncle, and also the squatters in the mongrel squatter tribes in Louisiana, and old Castro, and just how he talks about indigenous people in general all over it's all of a lot of his work kind of obviously it centers white men as the protagonists, but then their relationship with the scary ethereal sort of elements that drive Lovecraftian fear is always through a lens of like some indigenous tribe somewhere, like the West Indies, or whether it's like the tribes of squatters in Louisiana, or the Eskimo tribes and all of this sort of stuff. Like the one thing that all of these indigenous references in these Lovecraft stories have together is that they all kind of have like a universal alliance of worship and reverence towards the cosmic horror that plagues the white man. You know, it's pretty on the nose in many instances, especially Shadow over Innsmouth. Obed Marsh goes off and weds some indigenous woman from the East Indies, I think, and then comes back and starts converting his fishing village into some foreign cult, of which they all then suddenly turn into like Dagon-like creatures and whatnot. But just like the descriptions of, you know, how that whole thing went down when you read that book, just sounds like it's very nakedly on the face of it like this weird fear of, it's obviously fear of the other very literally, but also of like race mixing and all that sort of stuff. Young Lovecraft had a lot of resentment and hatred towards minorities and, you know, non-whites in general, but also he was fairly anti-Semitic at some points too. The thing that a lot of people don't know is that towards the end of Lovecraft's life, he kind of sort of starts to like have a face turn, you know, like he kind of has a little bit of a realization that young Lovecraft was a douchebag. Yeah, he actually admits that he's embarrassed by a lot of his earlier takes, his earlier writings. In addition, not just from the race point of view, but a lot of his racial resentment stemmed from his struggles in his young life with finding employment, especially like Horde Red Hook. He was trying to get work in New York and just saw that there were so many, you know, black and brown people and people from Europe and whatnot, and foreign invaders that were taking the jobs, and he had a hard time getting a job, and, you know, blamed it on them. You know, blamed it on ethnic minorities. You know, and he had this kind of a worldview of, it's a white supremacist worldview, but like the way that he describes it in a lot of his writings almost seems like it's meritocracy by the way of being white being your merit. You know, in addition to just like, you know, kind of being embarrassed by his intolerant views from his youth, he also just goes full on into like unapologetic anti-capitalism, you know, which is really the kind of Lovecraft that you love to see. So let me see if I can I like this track. What is this? This was on an earlier stream I did, and I really liked it. Softy Glimpses. It's a letter from Lovecraft. Later on in life, I think this was like maybe two years, maybe. When did he die? Let me see when this was. 37. So this is actually the year he died. So it was literally one of the last things he wrote. This was February 2nd. He died in March. So this was like a month before his death. All this from the antiquated mummy who was on the other side until 1931. Well, I can better understand their inert blindness and defiant ignorance of the reactionaries from having been one of them, describing himself as a reactionary. I know how smugly arrogant I was, wrapped up in the arts, the natural, not social sciences, the externals of history and antiquarianism. Let me zoom in. The abstract academic phases of philosophy, and so on. All the one-sided standard lore to which, according to the traditions of the dying order, a liberal education was limited. All this comes up with the humiliating force through an incident of a few days ago, when young Conover, having established contact with Hindenburger, the ex-owner of WT, obtained from the latter a long epistle which I had wrote Edward Baird on February 3rd, 1924, in response to a request for biographical and personal data. Little Willis asked permission to publish the text in his combined SFC fantasy, and I began looking the thing over to see what it was like, for I had not the least recollection over having penned it. Well, I managed to get through after about 10 closely typed pages of egotistical reminiscence and showing off and expressions of opinion about mankind and the universe. I did not faint, but I looked around for a 1924 photograph of myself to burn, spit on, or stick pins in. Holy Hades, was I that much of a dub at 33, only 13 years ago? There was no getting out of it. I really had thrown all that haughty, complacent, snobbish, self-centered, intolerant, key word, intolerant bull at a mature age when anybody but a perfect damn fool would have known better. That earlier illness had kept me in seclusion, limited my knowledge of the world, and given me something of a fatuous effectiveness of a belated adolescent when I finally was able to get out more in 1920 is hardly much of an excuse. Well, there was nothing to be done, except to rush a note back to Conover and tell him I'd dismember him, and run the fragments through his sausage grinder if he ever thought of printing such a thing. The only consolation lay in the reflection that I had matured. A bit since 24. It's hard to have done all one's growing up since 33, but that's a damn sight better than not growing up at all. Pretty significant. Acknowledging that he was an intolerant prig. And, he's embarrassed by it. He was embarrassed by it and threatened to butcher a dude who published some of his more intolerant writings. And then there's this one. For every well-fed Casper milquetoast whose personal advantage is served by prosperity of the utility company which gives him a fat salary, there are 1,000 or 2 John Smiths whose personal advantage, indeed whose endurable existence, depends on governmental regulations of the company's hours and wages and rates, and perhaps on the government's absorption and non-profit operation of that company. The government's absorption and non-profit operations of that company. That, to me, sounds like seize the means of production, my friends. Now that John Smiths are beginning to know where their advantage lies, they will act just as Casper does, blindly upholding what will personally serve them best. And when their millions of votes are counted against those Caspers, the result is not hard to predict. The trend is further promoted by the fact that not all fat salaried beneficiaries of capitalism are Caspers. A few can reason and can see that capitalism is automatically doomed by the natural course of economics unless upheld by fascist bayonets. Let's reread that last Lovecraftian prose. A few can reason and can see that capitalism is automatically doomed by the natural course of economics unless upheld by fascist bayonets. H.P. Lovecraft's letter to C.L. Moore, February 2nd, 1937, approximately 1 month before he died. And the last one here. But the real joke, of course, is... But the real joke, of course, is that all this isn't a matter of choice anyhow. I always do that when I see an exclamation point. Capitalism is dying from internal as well as external causes, and its own leaders and beneficiaries are less and less able to kit themselves. 1924. Remember, this is 1924. Or 1937, rather. This is 1937. I'm no economist, but from recent readings, I've been able to form a rough picture of the dilemma, the need to restructure consumers' goods and to pile up a needless plethora of producing equipment in order to maintain the irrational surplus called profit, which has caused orthodox economists like Hayek and Robbins to admit that only starvation wages and artificial scarcity could stabilize the profit system in future and avert increasing cyclical depressions of utterly destructive scope. Laissez-faire capitalism is dead. God, I wish that were true. Laissez-faire capitalism is dead. Make no mistake about that. The only avenue of survival for plutocracy is a military and emotional fascism whereby millions of persons will be withdrawn from the industrial arena and placed on a dole or in concentration camps with high-sounding patriotic names. That or socialism. Take your choice. Let's read that again. The only avenue of survival for plutocracy is a military or an emotional fascism whereby millions of persons will be withdrawn from the industrial arena and placed on a dole or in concentration camps with high-sounding patriotic names. That or socialism. Take your choice. In the long run, it won't be the New Deal, but the mere facts of existence which will be recognized as the real and inevitable slayer of Hooverism. Nobody is going to, quote, destroy the system, for it has been destroying itself ever since it evolved out of that old agrarian handicraft economy a century and a half ago. Right before he passed away, really fucking, for lack of a better phrase, he really woke up to the realities of the disastrous capitalism that was corroding and corrupting, American society, pre-New Deal, the New Deal era, which, could best be summed up also by this. Begins to regret past bigotry, dies immediately. Being a good person saps your life force. If he had remained the obnoxious, intolerant, racist prick that he was when he was younger, he'd probably still be alive today.